There are two principal ways of understanding how this city fits into American culture. The first one is based on the idea that the United States is a nation of futurity, a culture that is in the process of realizing itself. And in this notion, American culture is really made in this city. It's made by people who, coming from other countries or who are internal migrants from other places in the U.S., who take advantage of that vast field of difference that the city is by experimenting with other selves, by submitting to, by being seduced by the city and all that it has on offer, ways of living, ways of understanding oneself, ways of experiencing and relating to modern life. And so American culture is made by this mingling of cultures, by the crossing and the recrossing of cultural boundaries, by the experiments and the production of new ways of understanding what life has on offer. So in that sense, American culture is not a thing, it's a process. It's something that is constantly being realized. And the arts of the city are representations of this experience of creating an urban habitus. And all the friction and the conflict that we see in the city, in the arts of the city, the moments of elation, the moments of defeat, these are what the making of culture actually is. So the city in this sense is the cauldron of American culture. And it's also the cauldron of American democracy, because the city is the place where this promise of American democracy faces its greatest test. The question is, can American democracy actually function as a multiracial, multi-creedal polity that governs itself and governs itself fairly? And that's something that obviously the jury is very much still out on. But if American democracy is achieved, it's going to be achieved through the culture and politics of the city. Now, the second story imagines that culture and nature are very much combined, that culture is something that springs up from the soil, and therefore that American culture is made through contact with the American soil. This was the notion that Crevecoeur was talking about in the Letters of an American Farmer, when he talked about how the immigrant comes out to the farmland and he loses his old prejudices and he loses his old belief and he takes on the new ones. Well, the new ones that he takes on are these specifically American values that have been there seemingly since the beginning, since the U.S. moved off the frontier, where people were too much enamored of Europe and hadn't really separated themselves yet. This is really a Jeffersonian notion as well, a notion that the true American culture is an agrarian culture, that it's only as yeoman farmers tending their own soil and being free and independent that American culture separates itself from the classes and castes of Europe. Of course, that also means that we need to forget the removal of native peoples and the enslavement of Africans brought over to America. That this exceptionalism rests on. But obviously, then, this city is precisely a threat to a culture that has already been realized. And we can see this very much in American politics today and really throughout the 21st century, that there is this one party who has a notion of America as something that was achieved for all time, and another that has not finished experimenting with America yet. The only paradox in that sense is how it came to be that the most urban identified of presidents, the one who embodies all of the bad traits that the country parties used for centuries to describe Americans, is actually the person who led the charge. However, the situation is actually more complex than this presentist notion of the city versus the country. The countryside and the rural would suggest, because this infatuation with the Jeffersonian notion of the agrarian goes far back in American literary history and in the disciplinary history of American studies. A century ago, we can see V.L. Parrington, who told the main currents of American history really as a fight between the sort of Jeffersonian agrarianism and the evils of the city. The city were going to be where people were interdependent, not independent. They were going to be not landholders, but employees who sold themselves, sold their body for labor, and therefore, because they own nothing, were going to be easily manipulable. So Parrington's whole story is really, he wants to tell a story of the triumph of the sort of populist force over the forces of centralization, but as he reaches the 20th century, he realizes actually that he's put himself into a box because he is now facing a culture that has moved on from the agrarian. The America that he grew up on in the Kansas frontier is just not the country that we have today. We see Lewis Mumford, who is a trenchant critic of technology and also of cities, and who was very influential, and his critique of technology still remains influential in American studies, but that was also wedded to this critique that went on for centuries about the city as the death of culture and the rise of Babel and the rise of technological civilization, and that the only American antidote was a sort of compromised Jeffersonianism of the Garden City. In American literary history, we can trace a line at mid-century from Henry Nash Smith to Robert Spiller to Leo Marx. Smith really invented the West or following up on Turner, invented the frontier in the Virgin Land, and then Robert Spiller wrote the book The Cycles of American History, which takes us through cycle one, which is the conquest of the wilderness by the garden, the agrarians who set up the ideal America of the garden of the world in the West, in Spiller's phrase. But then cycle two is the tragedy of the conquest of the garden by the machine and the fall out of Eden. Leo Marx follows up on that by writing a book called The Machine in the Garden, the focus of which is very much the garden. And Marx's argument is that he's turning to the pastoral because it's only in these voices of dissent, again, that were rural, the voices of some political radicals and writers and artists and intellectuals associated with the countryside, who were the American critique of the rise of the machine and the rise of industrial capitalism. And so Marx, too, leaves aside the critique that's coming from inside the city and the politics, the political movements within the city and the cultural movements within the city that are actually coming to terms with the world that we live in today. And that sort of nostalgic critique, that looking back to a lost America, was still very powerful when I was in graduate school. And you can see that very line of thought in the classic critique of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, The Incorporation of America. Alan Trachtenberg cites this line as part of his critique of what happened at the end of the century. But it's not, it still happens today, and within the last 10 years. Michael Hart wrote a book called Radical Jefferson, and he is trying to find in Jefferson texts that are going to Americanize the political vision that he and Antonio Negri are working out. But then just this past year, Christian Parenti responded with a book called Radical Hamilton. We can see Parenti's book as an updating of Herbert Crowley's argument for Hamiltonian means toward Jeffersonian ends. Parenti's argument is that living in the sort of society that we are now, the agrarian is absolutely pointless. And what we need is something more like the Hamiltonian dirigist state. I'm not endorsing that, but what I want to point out is just how prevalent these arguments are and just how much of an appeal the Jeffersonian individualist agrarian myth in which the city has no place remains attractive to American radicalism. The city's future is crisis, and I say that not as a negative judgment, but recognizing the fact that the city lives by change. That's what differentiates it from other forms of life. And so there will always be people who are seeing in the changes of the city the death of the city. And the death of the city has been predicted for well over a century at this point. When I was in high school, Gerald Ford famously told New York to drop dead. That's how the Daily News interpreted the refusal to give it a bailout. And those lean budget years and people fleeing the city led to what Marshall Berman later called the taxi driver years in New York, and the Bernhard Goetz years in New York. And this was proof that the city was finished. By the time I started writing on cities in graduate school, there were all sorts of theories of our post-urban future, whether it was going to be suburban, post-suburban, or edge city. What they had in common was the notion that the city was done for. As I started putting this book together, I was reading in journals and news magazines quite the opposite, though. The city was back. The city was having its renaissance, and the city was thriving to an extent that it hadn't for 50 years. And there were even superstar cities, Richard Florida was calling them at that point. The years of urban triumph lasted 3 or 4 years, and toward the end of that, what happened was that the city was a victim of its own success. It was so popular that nobody went there anymore. So the moral of the story is that the city's as fine as the city can be. This churn is what makes the city what it is. And if, in fact, there is a drawdown from a slight drawdown from the urban population because of COVID, if some of the wealthy run off in search of better tax regimes, this will allow the real creative class to return to the city, the culture producers, the culture makers, who will continue this process of making American culture. So to that extent, I think the city of the future of the city, to the extent that there is the city in the U.S., is actually pretty good. The obvious other side of that is that there is no way in a social, scientific, economic, or other cultural sense of talking about the city in a way that equally describes New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Cleveland, Detroit, and New Orleans. Cities are also very different places. They share things in common, but they have their own histories, they have their own crises, they have their own solutions. And one of the things that we'll see out of this, I think, is a realization that it's not the states, as we always say in this country, it's not the states that are the laboratory of democracy. It's the cities that are the laboratory of democracy. The states have been busy recently saying no to everything that comes out of the city, whether it be living wage or universal basic income or earnest enforcement of environmental laws, or rethinking policing, or making voting easier. The states are resisting that. The cities are the forces of change in this country, and I would argue that the cities always have been and always will remain so as long as there are cities in this country.